Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Joining me for the third time on the podcast is Emre Doğru. He's a managing partner at Corpera Consulting. Emre has been so nice to come on and do a first election reaction to Erdogan's in Turkey's elections and Erdogan's surprising performance in the first round. He also came on before that to talk about Turkish politics. Here he is for round two, and Emre and I have different opinions about what Erdogan's victory means for the future of the Turkish economy and Turkish market. So we debate that a little bit as well. Listeners, otherwise, my email address is jacob@cognitive.investments. If you want to learn more about CI, the wealth management services we provide, the research we provide, or you just want to chit chat, that's how you get to me. Leave a rating or review if you haven't, and cheers. See you out there. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. All right, Emre, we're back at it. I think these results a little less surprising than maybe the first round. This almost felt like a fait accompli. I don't know about you. I felt confident enough that he was going to prevail in round two that I sent out my reports last week as if he'd already won, which is a dangerous thing to do. I really was chancing fate with that. But was there anything in the results that you thought was particularly surprising or interesting that struck your vision?
Actually, I mean, as you said, after the first round, it was quite, certain that Erdogan was going to win in the second round. And particularly because he did much better than expected, contrary to a lot of the opinion polls in the first round. And secondly, his People's Alliance, together with his allies, they gained the majority in the parliament. So even though this was the first time that Turkey held a second round election, based on our understanding of the Turkish people's sociology and their perspective to politics, we were quite sure that the Turkish people would opt for a president that also controls the parliament to ensure that stability and certainty and the predictability continues. So, people were betting against each other. Though, to be fair, I would say that the opposition camp made a very big change in its electoral campaign strategy. As you may heard, right after the first round, they developed a new strategy and tried to appeal to the nationalist voters, especially by appealing to the voters who are very disturbed about the immigration and the Syrian refugees who are currently residing in Turkey. So the opposition adopted a very anti-immigrant and nationalist rhetoric to get the support of the nationalist voters, and also allied with a anti-immigrant minor political party. But still, it was not sufficient for the opposition and the President Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu to win against Erdogan.
I asked you this before we started recording. I mean, I know that that Istanbul mayor, whose name is now escaping my mind, he was originally, like when I first started looking at polls for this almost a year ago, I feel like he was the presumptive candidate to run against Erdogan. And of course, he was, I think he was arrested and given a jail sentence because apparently he called the Supreme Election Council, I think fools was the term that he used. The question I'm winding up to here is, if it had been somebody besides Kılıçdaroğlu, do you think it would have been different, or do you think this is like Erdogan just has his finger on the pulse and he's going to be hard to beat?
I mean, that's the main controversy and the debate within the opposition camp for the moment. I mean, a lot of people now, especially the disgruntled opposition voters, they are blaming Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu for portraying himself as the only candidate for the presidential election. I mean, as you said, the mayor of Istanbul, Ekrem İmamoğlu, who won in 2019 as the mayor of Istanbul after 25 years of rule of the conservative the government side. So he was a popular candidate, but he was not nominated as a candidate, partially because, as you said, there is an ongoing trial against him. The other candidate was mayor of Ankara, Mansur Yavaş. But I mean, a lot of people argued that he has a nationalist background and probably the Kurdish citizens would not vote for him because of his nationalist background. But ironically, between the second round of the elections, the opposition camp, adopted a very nationalist rhetoric, and still the pro-Kurdish party decided to support the opposition camp. This candidacy thing is the hot topic here right now, and the opposition party, the People's Republican Party, a lot of people are criticizing Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, and they're asking for a leadership change. And he's almost 75-year-old, and he lost a lot of elections against President Erdogan. So a lot of people are arguing that it's time to go for the moment. And it seems like the mayor of Istanbul, Ekrem İmamoğlu, is up for the job.
What happens to CHP as we go from here? I mean, we know what's going to happen with AKP and Erdogan. It's going to be sort of business as usual at the top of the Turkish government. Is the opposition just broken? Is it going to fade into nothingness? Is it going to be a bunch of smaller factions and parties? I'm reminded a little bit of the Labour Party in Israel, which goes from, secular steward of a democracy for half a century, and then when it collapses real fast to the point that basically there is no Labour Party in Israel anymore, or not one with any political influence. Is that what is the future of the CHP? Do you think there's any future for that party, or do you think the opposition landscape is going to look very different in 5 years?
I mean, there is no question that there is going to be a big infight inside CHP, because there are different factions within the CHP as well. There is more like a nationalist, secularist, Kemalist factions within CHP. There are more like social democrats. There are those who successfully advocated for allying with the Kurdish party. And right now it seems like the Republican, nationalist, secularist, the strictly secularist faction of CHP is gaining ground. They're criticizing the current leadership of CHP of failing its strategy. So it could be the case that there might be a strategy difference, a change of strategy within CHP, and leadership change, of course. And regarding the broader opposition alliance, which is the National Alliance, which was composed of both CHP, Good Party, the Center-Right Party, and also 4 minor parties composed of some breakaway parties of Justice and Development Party. So now they're going to be in the parliament with different distribution of seats. And of course, there will be various political parties inside the parliament, I think like 16 parties or so. So I find it hardly possible for the National Alliance to remain intact and to remain coherent and all together once the parliament starts operating.
Yeah.
And President Erdogan, actually, he started giving the indications of this. He started saying that, some of the minor political party candidates were on the list of CHP. So basically, once the operation starts in the parliament, 40 members of CHP will break away. So it's going to be a difficult period for the opposition, obviously.
Yeah. Last question on the results before we turn to sort of the future, which I think is the more interesting question here. But I think we could talk for hours about Western media and English language media and how it covers Turkey and whether that's good or bad or too simplistic. But I do think there's a narrative in English language media about Turkey as being this place where secularism and religion are clashing, and viewing every single election or every single problem in Turkey as, well, Erdogan represents religion and CHP and these other guys represent secularism and Ataturk, and it's this sort of push and pull back and forth. And I think that's an overly simplistic reading of Turkey, and there's a lot more obviously going on in Turkey than that. But I do think there's something to be said about the fact that these election results, I think, tell us that nationalism is really the thing that is moving a majority of the Turkish electorate. And it is something, it's in some ways, maybe it's more important than ethnicity, and it's more important than religion, and it's even apparently more important than good government policy. There's some sort of nationalism that I can't even put my fingers on. I don't even know how you'd go about measuring it. Obviously, pollsters had a really difficult time measuring it, but that sort of pride or national, that seems to be the thing that Erdogan is freebasing into his political futures. Just talk about that. Do you think that that's what's going on? How do you explain the divides within Turkish society? Are they really that serious? Or is Turkish society actually a little more unified than we think? It's just not unified in the direction that people want to think.
Yeah. I mean, the Turkish society, as you said, is very diverse, and there are a lot of factions within the Turkish society. But nationalism seems to be the cross-cutting ideology for the Turkish people, right? So, and this is not because a lot of, most of the people vote for the Nationalist Movement Party. Only just 10% of the people voted for the Nationalist Movement Party. But, there are people who have nationalist feelings and who vote based on nationalist emotions. in almost all political parties like CHP, the Nationalist Movement Party, the Justice and Development Party. So those who are claiming that it's just a divide between secularists and conservatives are certainly wrong. Just tell them to look at the picture on the palace on the night of election when Erdogan was making his victory speech. There was this picture of Atatürk on Erdogan's palace. So it's much more than that, and I think Erdogan understands the importance of creating a new establishment, which includes conservatives, but also secularists, nationalists. So it's a broader alliance of political players in Turkey who represent different factions of society, but who acknowledge Erdogan as the leader of this new regime and the new establishment. And of course, there are different factions who will be left out, such as Social Democrats and the Kurds and some other minor groups. But I think Erdogan understands that in order to gain and maintain control in Turkey, you need to appeal to a very diverse group of stakeholders and the societal factions.
Yeah, but to your point, not the Kurds. And I mean, I mentioned Israel earlier. I mean, this is sort of, it reminds me of India a little bit, which is the BJP in India using Hindu nationalism to speak to, maybe the largest potential cross current that you can get from an election perspective. But that means you're isolating Muslims, and India has hundreds of millions of Muslims inside the country. So what is the future of the Kurd? If you're a Kurd today in southeastern Turkey, you must be feeling pretty dejected. I imagine you don't feel any Turkish nationalism at all in your bones today.
Sure, and it's also quite interesting that the Kurdish political party performed worse than expected in the parliamentary elections. They got 8.6%, whereas they were expecting more than 10%. So there is definitely a concern among the Kurdish voters regarding how to move forward. And we should always keep in mind that, according to the polls, 40% of the Kurdish population actually votes for Erdogan. So there are Kurds who are more secular, there are Kurds who are more religious. We need to be careful about, not to take Kurds as a monolithic, homogeneous group.
Yeah, fair enough. Anything else about the results, Emre, before we turn to the future that you wanted to say?
I think it's important to keep an eye on what kind of messages Erdogan gave, especially on the election night. It was almost like a continuation of his election campaign, because based on, his previous, what we call balcony speeches, the speeches that he gives at the balcony of this political party on the election night, it's always, more subtle, more welcoming, more the elections are over, let's look forwards and let's reconcile differences kind of speech. But this time it was a bit different than the previous ones, more harsh, even alienating LGBT communities, talking about the elections and talking about particularly the local elections, the municipal elections that is coming up in 9 months. Which will take place in March 2024. Obviously, it was a big defeat for Erdogan when his Justice and Development Party lost, especially Istanbul and Ankara in the last elections, and which led also to the rise of Ekrem İmamoğlu as the mayor of Istanbul. So there is no question that he is very much committed to regaining the local elections next year, and he has a winning formula, and I don't think that he will give up on that.
This is one of the reasons I would be a terrible politician, because if I won an election, I wouldn't want to hear the word election for 6 years. I would want to put my feet up and, but he's already thinking about the next election. I guess that's why he is who he is. Well, look, let's talk a little bit about the future. And I want to talk about foreign policy. I want to talk about domestic policy. But I think the thing that at least foreign investors and many of the people listening to this podcast are interested in are what's going to happen with the Turkish economy. And I know that listeners, if you want to go check this video out on YouTube, Emre has brought some slides. So he has some charts that he's going to be talking to. We will, of course, describe them. And if you just want to hear the beautiful sounds of our voices, that's fine too. But if you want to see our faces and you want to see these charts, it's online for YouTube, and we'll make sure the link is in the podcast notes here. Emre, you've been very, very kind to me. I wrote my analysis piece on where I thought the Turkish economy and Turkish markets were going a week ago, and you didn't say so much, but I could tell that you didn't agree with just about any word that I put in that paper. So I'm really interested to discuss this with you because I'm a little bit more optimistic, and that may be the contrarian me, and I am very, very self-aware that analysis could blow up in my face, but I actually see some signs of positivity. But maybe let's start with the non-positives. Do you want to start with inflation? Do you want to talk with the Turkish lira? Do you want to talk about reserves? You pick which negatives you want to start with.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are all interrelated, by the way, the reserves, the inflation rate, the policy rate. So these are all interrelated. So I would love to be optimistic about the Turkish economy, but all the signs and all the indicators that I'm looking at give me a little bit of less hope than you have. So let me talk about them first, and then I'll be looking forward to hearing your thoughts as well. So as you said, the main issue that the Turkish people are facing right now is the high inflation. It's almost like a cost of living crisis. Yep. And even Erdogan, in a speech today, on the election day speech, he again said that one of the priorities of his government will be to fight against inflation, which currently remains around like 44% in April 2023. Obviously, that was much higher last year. It reached more than 80%, and as a result of the base effect, now it's around like 44%, but it still remains too high for a lot of people, and their disposable income is decreasing. Now, the government is, of course, trying to address this issue by taking preventive measures, especially before the elections. We have seen increase in minimum wage. We have seen very generous early retirement schemes to be applied, but it seems quite unsustainable without decreasing the inflation. So the question is, how do you decrease inflation? Of course, the orthodox, mainstream economic policies say that you need to increase policy rate in order to decrease inflation, right? Which means, of course, a slowdown of economy. But it was quite clear before the elections and even now that the Turkish government is making a hard trade-off of not slowing down the Turkish economy. And how does Erdogan justify this? He says that, we are going to keep decreasing the policy rate, which currently stands at 8.5%, to lower the borrowing costs so that the inflation will decrease. So now a lot of people think that, Erdogan doesn't understand mainstream economics. He's going for unorthodox policies, this and that. But, from his perspective, there is a very rational reason, like it or dislike it, there is a very rational reason behind keeping the interest rates low, which is the fact that, it's the Turkish economy keeps growing. So from a political perspective, from Erdogan's aspect, it's more important to keep the economy growing rather than decreasing the inflation, because so long as the economy grows, the employment will increase, and with the additional benefits such as increase in wages and some tax breaks and that kind of things, people will feel less the negative impact of inflation. And of course, Turkish people, majority of Turkish people are also quite used to live at high inflation rates, back in early 2000s and even before that in 1990s. Mm-hmm. So the idea that inflation is the only determining factor is not 100% accurate. So when we look at, again, the CBRT policy rate, the Turkish Central Bank's policy rate, it remains 8.5%. So we're going to see whether or not it's going to decrease. So the other thing is this FX protected savings account. So, of course, the problem with the current policy is that, the Turkish government and Turkish people do not have much access to US dollar and euro. And now there is, differences between the official rate of euro and, those who are sold in Grand Bazaar. There is a widening gap between the two. And this is because mostly the FX protected savings accounts have been increasing. So this chart shows us that the savings accounts, the FX protected savings accounts, have reached $120 billion, which means that, so what is it, just in simple terms, what is FX protected savings account? Let's say I have US dollar. So if I put it in the FX protected savings account, in Turkish lira, I get, of course, an interest rate, so if the interest is lower than the depreciation of US dollar, let's say, so if the US dollar appreciates against Turkish lira, I still get the difference between the two. So it's a very attractive tool for ordinary Turkish people to protect themselves against inflation. And that's why it was a very attractive tool that people used. But of course, it increased the liability on the Turkish government to pay all this money back to the bank holders. So $120 billion is a huge liability, especially considering the fact that the Turkish government do not have much access to external financing nowadays. So as a result of the situation, the Turkish lira has weakened against the US dollar, especially following the elections, and it's now continuing. So the US dollar appreciates against Turkish lira. Back in 2009, it was around like $1 US dollar was equal to 3 Turkish lira. Nowadays it's 20, which means that all imported products are becoming more and more expensive. Now, of course, the Turkish exports are getting cheaper, but if you talk to the Turkish exporters, they're saying that it's not cheap enough. So they're asking for more devaluation of Turkish lira. And based on the conventional wisdom nowadays, it seems like the Turkish lira might reach to the point of 26, 27. So $1 US dollar might be equal to 26, 27 Turkish lira in a very short time. And actually today it was hovering near 21, 22. So again, the point is when the Turkish government does not get a lot of external financing, of course, it creates a particularly big problem for the Turkish economy, because the main structural issue in the Turkish economy is the current account deficit. So when we look at the current account deficit, it remains really high and due to large trade deficit. And still, despite all the chatter that, Russia postponed some of the energy bills for a couple of months, there is still, around 55 billion US dollar current account deficit, which is a huge amount of money for the Turkish economy to finance. How does the Turkish economy finances this? Of course, by borrowing and by getting portfolio investments and direct investments. So when we look at this chart, it's quite clear that there is a sharp decrease, especially in foreign direct investments. Still, there is a portfolio investment, but the share of portfolio investors, foreign investors in Turkish stock market hit a record low, which means that only 1/3 of the investors, the stock owners in Turkish stock market, is foreign investors. And actually, they still, in terms of numbers, it's less than 1%. So only 1% of the investors in the Turkish stock market are foreigners, but they still have around like 28% of the stocks that are owned by the foreigners in the Turkish stock market. So there is definitely a loss of interest by foreign investors, by foreign direct investors, but also by portfolio investors in Turkish stock market. What does it mean? So, of course, before the elections, it was very critical for the Turkish government to keep the US dollar stable because, for the Turkish peoples, for the ordinary Turkish citizen, the US dollar is the main indicator of how the economy is performing. Most people don't look at the interest rate, don't look at the inflation, whatever, but they just follow US dollar. So it was very important for the Turkish government to keep the Turkish lira stable, and due to the limitations to have access to international finance, the central bank used most of its reserves to fight against depreciation of the Turkish lira. And for the first time since 21 years, it seems that the bank's net reserves dropped below zero. So which means that this is a very dangerous territory for the Turkish central bank, because in the absence of reserves, net reserves, which means that, excluding gold and excluding swaps, and in the absence of big foreign, money inflow, it's hardly possible to fight against inflation and fight against depreciation of Turkish lira without increasing interest rates, which President Erdogan says that is not going to be his policy. And just a footnote here, he also made negative remarks against IMF during the victory speech as well. He said that, we finished our job with IMF back in 2013. So that's also, of course, very pleasing, very appealing for the Turkish people and their nationalist feelings. And it also is an indicator that the Turkish government will not go to the door of the IMF. So last but not least, because of all those vulnerabilities and fragility of the Turkish economy, after the second round, especially the 5-year CDS reached 700, which is a record level of CDS, as you can see in the chart. So that means that from a foreign investor's perspective, the Turkish investment environment is becoming more and more risky, especially if you take into account the impossible trinity of central bank reserves, foreign direct investments and portfolio investments, and inflation and the policy rate. So this is how I see it based on the numbers, Jacob. I'm also interested in hearing your thoughts, and we can also discuss some of the early signals of how Erdogan might be planning to fight against this fragile situation.
Yeah, there's so much to hack into there, and we've only got 20 minutes, so we'll probably just scratch the surface. First, I'll tell you a joke, Emre. This is one of my favorite jokes. A guy goes up to an economist and asks the economist, what is the economic impact of the French Revolution? And the economist looks at him and says, it's too early to tell. And I tell you that joke because I think the fixation on interest rates, I am not here about to endorse Erdogan's, comments about interest rates and how they're evil and the blah, blah, blah. But I do think that, especially in financial press, we have a tendency to overemphasize interest rates. Interest rates are a tool of a central bank. It's a hammer, and if every single problem is a nail, you're going to keep hammering on the thing over and over again. Now, Erdogan, as you said, has definitely intervened in the central bank. In some ways, the dynamics that most worry me and what you were talking about is the net reserves below zero, the currency reserves evaporating. If he doesn't instill, or I should say reinstill, confidence into the Turkish economy and to markets about the Turkish economy, he can rail against the IMF all he wants. He's going to be back there begging hat in hand, and we're a few steps away from Argentina if he doesn't reinstill some of that confidence, which is why I think this is a very interesting moment. He has to reinstill confidence. Now, whether he's going to do that by raising interest rates or not, that I don't know. If you look at some of the people that he's been talking to, courting on the campaign trail, if you look at some of the comments out of at least some factions of the AKP, they're using phrases like it's going to be responsible fiscal and monetary policy. It's going to have global legitimacy. We're going to have people involved. There's going to be stability and predictability. To your point, that doesn't tell me that they're going to raise interest rates. It does tell me, though, that they want to communicate some form of economic policy that isn't just Erdogan woke up one morning and decided he wanted breakfast and then that he wanted to fire the central banker and put a son-in-law in charge, all these other things. And the reason I raise all of that is because the one thing that Erdogan's right about, that he's not crazy about, is there are other ways to lower inflation besides dealing with interest rates. And for a country like Turkey, which is so overwhelmingly dependent on imports of energy and of food, I think that's one place where Turkey really has to focus. So if Turkey can drive down the domestic cost of energy, if it doesn't have to be so dependent on importing energy sources from abroad, that would probably be good for inflation. And I think one of the reasons you've seen inflation come off the boil here, despite the fact that he continues to lower interest rates, he did that after the earthquake, is because energy prices are down, astronomically from their height earlier, and Erdogan has maintained good relations with Russia. He's got that whole thing. He's got that relationship working. He's also got access via Russia to cheap oil if he wants it, or maybe even cheap natural gas. Energy is another thing that Turkey really needs to be talking. I already said energy. I'm sorry. I meant to say he also has access to Russian wheat and Russian grains and foodstuffs. This whole participation in the Black Sea Grain Initiative, the back half of that is you maintain access to Russian markets. And Russia has no one to sell this to in the West because nobody wants to buy Russian wheat anymore. Turkey, under Erdogan, has been very pragmatic towards Russia. Sure, we shoot down a fighter jet, then we're friends, and then we squabble over here, and then I'm having a phone call with you. He's kept those ties very, very open. So everything you said is right, and they're all reasons that this could blow up in my face. And like I say, it's the reserves are the ones that is most disturbing, because if he takes the election to be everything's fine, everything I did is fine, I just have to keep doing what I'm doing, then we're a couple steps away from Argentina. My bet, though, is that he knows I can't keep doing what I was doing. I can't just ignore what international markets say. I have to be as pragmatic towards Western markets as I am towards Russia, as I am towards China. And that means whether it's maybe I do have to stop the interest rate cuts, or maybe I have to raise interest rates a little, or maybe there's something else that I can do to try and convince the rest of the world that I'm serious about reform and serious about stability. If you can do that, maybe you will get foreign investors involved. And then the last point I would just make, though, is Erdogan's monetary policies and interventions in the central bank since 2018 have been like the exact opposite of what, if you were reading a version of The Prince today by Machiavelli about monetary policy, everything Erdogan has done since 2018 is the exact opposite of what you would be advised to do. And yes, the Turkish lira has weakened considerably. Before 20 was a level that I think was sort of unthinkable. Now you're talking 26, 27. Why stop there? Maybe we're going to go to 40. Maybe we're going to go to 60. I mean, there really is that lack of confidence there. But I will say that if you look at the performance of Turkish equities, and even with the exodus of foreign investors, Turkish equities have gone up. And Turkish equities have gone up because Turks themselves have nowhere else to put their money if they're going to try and keep pace with inflation. And yes, you mentioned that the lira has further weakened since Erdogan's victory. Istanbul Stock Index, it was up 5% yesterday. It's up another 3-4% today. And, this is not investment advice, but at CI, as soon as we realized Erdogan was in the driver's seat, we started buying Turkish equities because we thought that we would see that sort of similar dynamic. So even if all the things you talk about from an economic perspective are true, and even if he doesn't do any of the change, just that dynamic of getting rid of foreign investors on the index, but Turks themselves buying equities because they have no other instrument in Turkey that they can really latch on to keep pace with inflation, that should at least drive the equity performance up. And so you can have a situation where maybe the Turkish economy is doing terrible, but where Turkish equities could be the best emerging market trade of the year or of the next 5 years. So there's, I'm not completely sanguine. I'm not saying everything is great, but the risk reward here looks very compelling to me.
I mean, I agree with you that the Turkish people have no much choice to other than to invest in Turkish equities. I mean, and the numbers actually support your argument. I think the people who invest in Turkish stock market increased to 4.5 million. I mean, it's an important indicator. I mean, it might sound a bit small for most of the international listeners, but for Turkey, it's indicates something like 60% increase. So especially financial literacy and the interest in investing in stock market is increasing for the Turkish people. Like, coming back to your point about reinstalling the confidence, I think that is the main question that Erdogan has in mind right now. And even on the election nights and in his victory speech, he hinted that there will be an economy management that has international credibility. Yeah. So that's an important indicator. And since this morning, I don't know how many lists of members of cabinet I have received via WhatsApp groups, and everybody's sending each other a list of names, and even some of them are very creative. They put like Turkish flag and make it put in the template of a presidential decree to make it look more credible. But a lot of people are looking into Mehmet Şimşek, a former Merrill Lynch executive, and who also worked as minister in Turkey before. Now, before the elections, there were rumors that he refused to get a position in the government But nowadays we hear his name more and more, and especially as vice president or so, he would like to be most likely in a position to coordinate the economy management. And if he gets into that role, there are other ministers who are also identified and associated with more orthodox policies, such as Lütfi Elvan and Naci Ağbal. So these are people who have also bureaucratic backgrounds and understand, all the nitty-gritty details about, monetary and fiscal policy. Now, of course, the question is it the personalities that matter, or is it, how much they can convince President Erdogan to change his course in terms of monetary and fiscal policies? We're going to see. We're going to find out soon. I think the cabinet members and the new management will be announced on Saturday. It's going to be an important signal about how and to what extent the new Erdogan regime will be able to reinstall confidence in the eyes of the investors.
Well, and it's also about which investors we're talking about here, too, because I think one of the other things, I don't think Erdogan minds that Western investors have run to the hills in Turkey, because one of the reasons Turkey got into this position was because it gorged itself on dollar-denominated debt. So when Erdogan wanted to start engaging in some of these monetary policies and lowering rates and things like that, suddenly with Turkish companies having taken out loans in US dollars as the lira declined, that was going to be really problematic. So I think that's part of the reason that Erdogan has tried with these safety nets to reduce dependence on the dollar. But there are other sources of capital out there. I mean, you had this sort of at the end of your deck that you went through that was extremely good, and I'm happy to share it with the listeners. But, the Saudis and the Gulfi states aren't so happy with their investments in countries like Egypt and Pakistan, and they've talked about rolling back, just sort of being the bank of that part of the world. But Turkey's a little bit of a different story. Turkey is a modern industrial economy in the heart of the whole region that has a formidable military. It's a difficult enemy if you want to get on the wrong side, if it's a powerful ally, if you can sort of tie them together. There's we already mentioned Russia, which can't provide capital, but can provide cheap commodities which can help inflation. China's the other one that Erdogan has been immensely pragmatic about in terms of, can somebody change Erdogan's mind? Of course they can change Erdogan's mind. Erdogan is comfortable with contradiction. He wants to be the leader of the Muslim world, and yet he's willing to hang out with Xi Jinping and not mention the Uyghurs once in his face. There's plenty of room there and flexibility there, I think, and other sources of capital. So I would think that part of what Erdogan wants is he doesn't want to be so tied into Europe. He doesn't want to be so tied into the US. I think he is betting on, there's a multipolar world out there, and if I can sort of get my economy being the middle ground between them, and I can get inflation, if I can just do all these things and not be so dependent on the West so that I really can give the middle finger to the IMF and mean it, well, suddenly Turkey's in a very, very good position. So I don't know. For part of me here is making the argument that, let's say I'm wrong. If Erdogan doesn't do these things, if he can't reinstall confidence, if he continues to be, crazy dude on the couch railing about interest rates and what he thinks about interest rates because of what he read somewhere, then Turkey's going to become Argentina. I mean, that's the fast track to what we're talking about. And I like Erdogan is many things. He doesn't seem to me like he's stupid or crazy. Those are not adjectives that I would use to describe him. I think he's a little more pragmatic, and I would think that he sees that he's staring at the precipice, and if he doesn't take a step back right now, it's going to be terrible for Turkey. And it's that constraint is maybe what has me going forward. But I also would ask you, Rob and I talk about this every week on the podcast, and it's still very difficult for me. There is that relationship between the economy and between markets, and markets can be doing something completely different than what is actually happening in the economy. Because as you said, like the Turkish economy is really, really struggling right now, unless you're a Turkish exporter. But markets seem to be doing particularly well. I think the other part of what I'm talking about here is that I feel like the Turkish economy is in a very good place. Like you are stealing manufacturing market share from places like Europe and even from places like China. Like you're astride some of the most important trade lanes in the world. Like Turkey has a big opportunity from an economic perspective if it can line up all the policy blocks as well. So that's sort of separate from the markets. But I do think the long term, if you can get through this kind of crunch and this really scary looking reserve chart that you have here, like there is potential there, potential that say, Mohammed bin Salman would be dreaming of the redeeming qualities that the Turkish economy has inside of his country. He's nowhere close. And yet everybody's talking about how, Vision 2030 and Saudi Arabia is going to be great, but Turkey's going to collapse. Like something is not right there.
I mean, definitely Turkey has a much more sophisticated economy. It's an industrial production country. I mean, most of the Turkish exports are based on industrial products. The main weakness of the Turkish economy, again, is external finance. I mean, the national savings are below the OECD average. It is around like 12-13% in Turkey. Most of the exports, do not have a very highly sophisticated technology. So like advanced technology just constitutes like 2-3% of Turkish exports. So again, it's a industrial base in the region, and it can work with all other countries, around Turkey in the region. But of course, it really needs to get external financing to make more sophisticated investments, especially to keep up with, the changing world order, I think. There is a big opportunity, and in the long term, Turkey has the potential to grasp that opportunity. But again, it depends on, a few very basic but very important elements, which is, the talent, skilled young population is quite important. And also, of course, finance to fund investments. But other than that, the Turkish economy is on a strong hold.
So last question, I'll get you out of here on this, because I know we have to go, and we'll have you back soon, I'm sure. Maybe we'll have to do a municipal election recap if that's sort of the next big thing. If you're a listener and you're thinking about investing in Turkey, or if you're a company and you're thinking about Turkey in terms of supply chains, what is your message? Is your message here, this is risky? Is your message that long term is good, but there's a significant amount of pain in the short term? What is sort of your takeaway for someone from that perspective thinking about Turkey going forward?
Well, I mean, I work with a lot of investors, and I advise multinational companies operating in Turkey or looking for market entrance into Turkey. And of course, sometimes it gets a bit complicated for them to understand the Turkish politics and to get some visibility and predictability about the policies and policy choices and regulations. But in the end, it's always a business-friendly environment. The Turkish government, based on Erdogan's pragmatism, is very pragmatic. And even though, of course, there is some, especially before the elections, there was a lot of pressure on the private sector, especially on Turkish companies, to make sure that the unemployment doesn't increase and the prices don't go up. And all in all, even though, some regulations are getting stricter, it is an environment where, most of the multinational companies can make money and they have access to talented young people. So I think it's, with a long-term horizon, it's a good place to invest in. But again, it depends on the sophistication of your investments and, of course, the horizon that you're looking at.
All right. Well, Emre, this was great. Thank you for making the time. I know that you are busy as everything with everything that's going on. So we appreciate you making the time, and we'll have you back soon. Okay.
Sure. Pleasure to be here always.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.